Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with debunking the modal ontological argument for the existence of God 6 ways from Sunday. Today we are going to be looking at why the modal ontological argument begs the question and why this is a bad thing. We are going to once again be looking at Inspiring Philosophy's version of the argument and in fact responding to a video he made claiming that not only does it not beg the question, but begging the question is actually an okay thing. This is problematic and we're going to deal with it. So, the argument we're looking at is, it is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. If it is possible that God exists, then he exists in some possible worlds. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. Therefore, if God exists in the actual world, then God exists. As I said originally, all you have to do is prove premise 1. You have one job. However, this is a bit problematic, because if you only have one premise to prove, that just means that that premise is in fact equivalent to your conclusion. That premise just means the same thing as your conclusion. You're just, in the argument, explaining that it means the same thing. So, if you accept premise 1, you're actually accepting that God exists. This is problematic, and it's a fallacy called begging the question. Let's take a look. So, begging the question, as defined by Inspiring Philosophy, is a logical fallacy when the conclusion of the argument is considered to be proven without giving any new information other than what is given in one premise. As I just said, this argument does. So, it should be pretty clear that the argument begs the question, but Inspiring Philosophy seems a little confused and doesn't think that it does. Let's take a look. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. We have provided new information. It's the only premise we're allowed to do that. If any other premise provides more information, then it's not going to be okay. So, if it is possible that God exists, then he exists in some possible worlds. That's the definition of possibility. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. That's the definition of necessity. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. That's the definition of actual world. And finally, if God exists in the actual world, then God, a maximally great being, exists. All we've done is provide definitions. All we've done is explain the words that we used in the first premise and told us what they mean. When I say it's possible that God, a maximally great being, exists, all I'm really meaning is that God actually exists. So, clearly, if you accept that God exists, you accept that God exists. This is why begging the question is a problem. So, it is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. Inspiring Philosophy is going to go on about a distinction between de re and de dicto. The problem is this is a bit of a red herring. In fact, it's the red herring fallacy. Whether or not this premise is de re or de dicto has nothing to do with the question of whether or not any other premise offers additional information. If you are actually going to argue that it doesn't beg the question, tell me which other premise is not just a definition and actually offers more information. That's objection number 33, and if you missed it, here it is again. Here's the argument. It should be clear. 2 is the definition of possibility. 3 is the definition of necessity. 4 is the definition of actual world. The conclusion is equivalent to the first statement, having redefined and understood what we meant by all the words in that first statement. It is equivalent to that first statement, and since no other premise offers additional information, it begs the question. Now, Inspiring Philosophy is then going to say, it doesn't beg the question, it just uses circular reasoning. This is problematic. The difference that he's going to give between circular reasoning and begging the question is as follows. Circular reasoning is, there's a premise either implicit or explicit that is equivalent to the conclusion, while begging the question is a logical fallacy when the conclusion of an argument is considered to be proven without giving any new information other than what is given in one premise. Clearly, if something begs the question, it is going to commit the problem of circular reasoning. Now, circular reasoning is problematic. It is problematic because we aren't actually offering arguments. All we're doing is unpacking definitions. Now, sure, we can unpack definitions, but that's never going to be convincing to anyone. Here's why. Circular reasoning. It is okay if it's used to inform and not persuade. This is what Inspiring Philosophy says. So if I offered you the argument, God exists if and only if it is not the case, that it is not the case, that either it is the case that God exists or God does not exist. Therefore, God exists. This is an argument that uses circular reasoning. And all I'm doing is informing you that all of that complicated thing in premise 1 just means that God exists. So it's okay. It's not fallacious. God exists based on this argument. Clearly this is fallacious. It should be blatantly clear to anyone that this is not going to be convincing to anyone. All I've done is throw a bunch of logic speak into premise 1. That premise is still equivalent to the conclusion. It is not convincing to anyone. Your job is to offer an argument for premise 1. Explain why I should accept your first premise, not to only show that that premise is equivalent. If you offer an argument for premise 1, then you can show that premise 1 is equivalent to the conclusion you want. But until you have offered that argument, which you have yet to do, there's no reason for me to accept it. And so this circular reasoning is not going to be informative or persuasive, because your first premise is not substantiated. It's not justified. That's objection number 34. Objection 35. The burden of proof is always on the claimant. It's always on the person making the claim. If you claim God exists or something equivalent to that, you need to back it up. You need to back up your first premise. You can't just say, well, here's my first premise, everything else follows logically. You now have to prove that it's impossible that God exists. No, the burden of proof always rests solely on the shoulders of the person making the claim. If you didn't understand that, theists, here's going to be a lovely argument from the atheist side that would pose the same problems, would have the same flaws. And if you're unconvinced by that, that's why we're unconvinced by this argument. It is okay if it's used to inform, not persuade. So, here's my circular reasoning. God exists if and only if it is not the case that God existing is not equivalent to God not existing. Therefore, God does not exist. This is a valid argument. One is, in fact, equivalent to the conclusion. It's not going to convince anyone, though. Because all we're doing is taking God does not exist and we're futzing around with it, with logic speak, and changing it into something a little bit more complicated. But there's still no reason for us to accept one. Just as there's no reason for us to accept one of the modal ontological argument. That was why the ontological argument begs the question why this is a problem. Tomorrow we are going to be doing our final video in this series. That's going to be the anti-modal ontological argument, where once and for all, we will put down this style of argument as something one should use, because it's a problematic way to argue, and it's not going to give us truth in any sense of the word. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org. Stay skeptical, everybody.